Oh, great. I'm live. Hi, I'm Dave March, the Spy Guy, and I'm about to go into following up on yesterday's video on the birth of the CIA. I was going to watch and comment on a video from Eyes Wide Open. He's done a lot of like documentary work on this birth of the Central Intelligence Agency. And let me just turn off the theme. Wi-Fi. Vibrate. So yeah, he's done a lot of work on intelligence agencies, but he does also get more into conspiratorial stuff like GFK assassination stuff that we probably won't be covering here. I was on a Zoom call earlier with some friends from my part of the two-way community, and we're talking a lot about what was going on in Ukraine, and I gave my thoughts yesterday that on that particular video. And all these people they just take their straight up information from the mainstream media, and they take their information like GDP, like GDP's a gross domestic product is actually a number that means anything when the American dollar is inflated all the hell. Like, give me a break. Gold was once trading at 35 bucks an ounce. Now it's trading at $5,000. I think GDP is not much useful now. It's purchase power parity that lets you do those kind of stats. But I got to the point, like, I'm not interested in having an argument with you guys over these things. It's kind of like my Ukrainian relatives. I just don't want to get into a fight with them over the Ukraine war. So I always kind of deflect away from what I'm really thinking about things. And of course, I'm Polish. I don't want the Ukrainians to win. I don't want the Russians to win. So in some ways, the longer this war goes on, it's sort of like Canadians rooting for both sides in the U.S. Civil War. But I'm not a big fan of like, if these guys knew what I really thought about Ukraine, like, come on, like, Stepan Bandera. I know what that is. I know about the Galicia division. I know all these things. I studied World War II. Give me a break. Anyway, so we'll start up the video here and start covering this. This is a 30-minute video. He's got a lot of credit, and I do want to shout out to him. And let me go here, make sure this is from 2 years ago. I liked and subscribed to it. So, okay. Oh, let's see. Oh. There's my sound. Speakers are at 100.
The history of the CIA begins where much of modern history starts, during the Second World War. Shockingly, the United States did not have a dedicated foreign intelligence agency before the Second World War. The FBI handled...
Yeah, they also had a code breaking department, but World War I was done so fast. A lot of stuff was handled by Pinkerton agents, really, and private sector guys. So that's a situation there.
Handled domestic intelligence, much like it does today, and that was only founded in the early 20th century. It was...
Yeah. Actually, it's first known as just the Bureau of Investigation, and it's created by presidential fiat. So it's a little weird in that regard.
Is led by its longtime director, the first director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. All other foreign intelligence was largely handled...
I believe there is someone who runs Bureau of Intelligence before Hoover, but I got the book over there somewhere. We cover that when we talk about the FBI.
By the State Department and the Department of Defense. Before World War II, the entirety of U.S. intelligence capabilities and capacity could be found in a few disparate filing cabinets at the State Department. All this would change.
Actually, there was one the first foreign intelligence agency of the United States of America is the Office of Naval Intelligence. So that is definitely around beforehand. So, and all the various military attaches who are doing that kind of stuff. But technically, ONI is the group. And there's a lot of conspiracies about ONI too.
And balloon during the war, as the United States was caught off guard by Pearl Harbor in 1941. The surprise attack by the Japanese on Hawaii necessitated a response from President Roosevelt, where he created the Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS.
Yeah, it's kind of surprising that they were surprised by that. The Pearl Harbor is like, why don't you have a combat air patrol? Why don't you have PBYs on patrol when you have all this war footing? And like, I know that the Admiral Kimmel at the time had like, wives would complain if their husbands were on a boat more than 2 days of the thing. But you're leading up to a war here. Like, you should tell the wives to shut up and have regular naval patrols. It was kind of ridiculous what was happening in the peacetime area of that area. Also, people were like shocked that the Japanese were able to move their carrier groups so close to there to hit. But the fact is that the British had done the same damn thing at Taranto a year before. I have an article on it somewhere that I wrote for World at War magazine. And basically what happened is, so the British come in, they sink a bunch of Italian battleships. Their magnetic torpedoes don't work because no one knew what a magnetic field was yet, but they really just sunk up the ship. And then the Japanese naval attaché comes down and looks at all the results. And then he gets transferred about 3 months later to Hawaii to be the Japanese naval attaché there. And starts figuring out all how models their attack plan based on what the British did at Taranto.
OSS for short, an innocuous sounding agency that would oversee all intelligence and covert operations during World War II. Now, this is important here to make a note. Office of Strategic Services, on the surface, sounds quite, benign. This is something that was often used throughout the CIA's history. They would name operations, they would name departments, very banal sounding names to try to make the public unaware of the sinister undertones within those agencies. So let's get into the history of the OSS and how the CIA became what it is today. I guess let's lay out a few quick things before we get into the actual history. Throughout this series, a general theme that will be explored heavily will be that of the CIA as an integral part of a parallel shadow government beside the elected government of the United States. Now, I want you all to hold on. This is language that is highly codified. It's been used often by the American right, especially since the rise of Trump.
And before that, by the American left. You got to remember that a lot of this stuff comes out. Frank Church is a Democrat.
And right-wing populism has become very strong in the United States. I think that this is actually really muddies the water for serious conversations about the existence of a deep state within a country. The United States is not the only country in the world with a deep state.
That's true. Russia's deep state rules openly. They don't have to be a deep state. They just run it openly.
Can actually be observed everywhere. Pretty much any democratic capitalist country has a deep state to speak of. Let's just get into the explanation of it and the theory behind it. The theory of deep states and deep politics was developed by a man named Peter Dale Scott. And essentially, his theory goes that the United States has obviously an elected government, that being the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the presidency. Although behind this overt government stands a largely unelected, unaccountable, and often reactionary wing of the government that acts as a guardian of elite interests and corporate profits. This is often termed the deep state. This term deep state has been hijacked by right-wing conspiracy theorists, as I've said, using it to denounce any government actors that they disagree with. And
left-wing actors before them. Just reminding that.
Series, we'll be using the term deep state to mean any unelected officials that work to undermine the democratic will of the people of the country. And most of the time it will be the United States, but also all the other countries that will be impacted by the CIA throughout this history. Going by this definition, the deep state will include in this series, just as a short list, the Department of Defense, primarily the Pentagon and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but we can also include the entire sort of security state, as it's called, which includes the Department of Homeland Security and a lot of other affiliated departments. Just for example, the Department of Defense also has an intelligence unit. So does the Air Force. So does the Navy.
Yeah, what is it? Trying to remember. Defense Intelligence Agency. The Reagan administration stopped believing the CIA reports because they thought they were very inaccurate and started relying more on the Defense Intelligence Agency, who they felt was giving the more reflective, interesting information. So, and that's a thing. I could also get into the histories of some of these smaller sub-organizations. I got Conspiracy X over there that would have some of that information.
So all of these pieces together form sort of the security state. This deep state also includes the FBI, which can be seen quite clearly as a domestic counterpart to the CIA. It includes the defense industry itself, sort of what we're going to call the military-industrial complex. So essentially all of the industries in the United States that produce weapons, arms, military technology, these have a very strong role in American government and will continue to gain a larger role throughout this history. This will also include any industries that have maybe an indirect link to military. For example, the oil industry, fossil fuels, think tanks and institutions such as NATO and the International Monetary Fund, organized crime elements. For example, the mafia not only in the United States, but across the world. This can include church institutions such as the Vatican, which will be very important with the history of Operation Gladio, which will be coming up shortly. And of course, arguably the center of this deep state network is the CIA. Now, it's important to note that these institutions are not always working explicitly together, right? I mean, we're not talking about...
Yeah, you have to remember that these are all factions and organizational groups and individuals, like John Kiriakou, who was deputy director, chief of staff. Definitely was not necessarily aligned with a lot of this stuff, but they all use this stuff, and it's all criminal. As I've said, especially when they point out the mafia, all these groups are criminal conspiracies, and we are just one more criminal conspiracy and a bunch of criminal conspiracies overlapping and running the world in the background. So there you go.
All of these people, right? This is quite a large group of organizations I've talked about here. And you could be skeptical, and I wouldn't blame you for being skeptical, that all of these people are colluding in a serious way to push their interests. The important thing is that these groups undeniably all have shared interests, those being capital, those being US empire, and those being anti-communism. These three central tenets come together in all.
And we can, if you want to go down some other ways, maybe it's not expanding the American empire. Maybe it's just the latest line, and America is the latest line of an empire that hasn't been going back to the fall of Rome. Certainly there's some people out there who will talk about it. Some groups called the Praetorians. Some will say it's the British. All roads lead to London. These are all interesting. Conspiracies or open conspiracies? Well, everything's a conspiracy. Just because there's conspiracy theories doesn't mean there aren't conspiracies. There's thousands of conspiracies that are happening every day.
All of these institutions to create what could be considered a blob or the deep state, a link of organizations.
And I would also say ending socialism. A lot of these people are now socialists. So I think starting in after World War II, yes, ending socialism, but now it's starting to look like they're trying to create socialism as the method of control, or have used socialism as a method of control. What does it say? Every organization that isn't explicitly conservative or right wing will eventually be dominated by leftists.
A network that moves in unison to push these goals forward, with the central piece being the CIA and arguably the security state as a whole. Now, as is typical of these deep institutions, the OSS was not created as a usual military establishment. Much like the future CIA, its offshoot, the OSS was quickly filled with members of the elite ruling class, which will be seen throughout this series, not only in the CIA, but across this entire deep state network, is that most of the people involved are not average folks like you and I. These are people that come from Wall Street. These can be bankers, lawyers, business executives, former generals. These are the types of people that filled the ranks of the early CIA and the OSS. So it's important to note that these are not average US soldiers. These are people that come from the American elite class.
Yeah. What I've often maintained with these conspiratorial things is the current elite class trying to continue their power and only allowing a handful of people in. And you'll have people talking about the fact that this is going back. It's just like the latest institutional control that goes back to, like I said earlier, the fall of Rome.
So I guess we'll start with the first director of the Office of Strategic Services. The first director was William Donovan, otherwise known by his nickname Wild Bill. William Donovan's nickname of Wild Bill comes from the baseball player Wild Bill Donovan, who would coach the Yankees between the years of 1915 and 1917. He's most notable for being a World War I hero, and he was also a self-made millionaire Wall Street lawyer. During World War I, he served as the U.S. Coordinator of Information, which was an early intelligence arm of the U.S. Department of Defense. So when FDR created the OSS in 1942, Donovan was likely high on his list. He had some intelligence background, and Donovan was named as its director. Now, in the history of American intelligence, Donovan was largely overshadowed by his subordinates, especially a man named Allen Dulles.
Yeah, we covered Allen Dulles already, and probably covering him more in the future. But Wild Bill was actually up for, at one point, they thought he was going to be president of the United States. So it's kind of weird that this guy who had such a illustrious war hero from the First World War kind of gets sidelined in later times. But definitely, if you want to watch my friends Mark Ribert and Eric Hunley's show, America's Untold Stories, they have a great deal to say about Wild Bill Donovan and his true history,
which we'll be talking about a lot in the early parts of the series. As the director of OSS, he worked as a coordinator, ensuring that his agents were undertaking successful missions. And most importantly, his army bona fides provided a cover for the OSS and the future CIA, as he was perceived as a respectful and dignified man by the security establishment. This is an important key. The CIA and the OSS were often scrutinized by the security state, as they believed that they could take over that role. So having Donovan as a military man, a former military hero, some would say, being the leader, gave a certain sense of legitimacy to the new OSS. Now, despite him being a quote-unquote honorable man at the time, most accounts of Donovan portray him as a blunder, failing to achieve success in his exploits, and overall just not having the success that the future CIA would have. For example, in a report written by Colonel Park about the OSS in 1945, this report was presented to President Truman when he was thinking of creating a new spy agency. Donovan is portrayed as a drunk that does not hire based on merit, but based on the, quote, old boy network of connections from Wall Street. Now, this is pretty glaring, especially since we know that elitism is deeply ingrained in the OSS.
Yeah.
Now, this is corroborated by a story of when Donovan went to Romania he left a briefcase filled with critical OSS intel in a brothel, which was later intercepted by Gestapo.
What is this guy, Canadian cabinet minister? Later intercepted by Gestapo agents, no less. Great.
The report notes that he often forgot about agents that he sent across the world, such as an OSS agent that was stranded in Liberia. He had also accidentally ordered to blow up some OSS agents in France in another blunder. Donovan was subsequently dismissed by Truman and replaced by Roscoe Hillenkoetter, a U.S. naval officer, to become the first director of the CIA. So at the end of the
that's what I
day,
was thinking yesterday when I was watching that video, or 2 days ago on Wednesday when we were watching the video and we were talking about the fact there were other people before William Bell Smith to be CIA directors. Like, I'm pretty sure there are some other people in there first.
President Truman did not have faith in Donovan, and he was fairly ineffective as a leader of intelligence. And I think Truman saw more respect in and more dignity in an actual operating military officer, even though Hillenkoetter, as we'll see later, was not exactly a saint himself either. Quite a devious man himself. Now, this is bringing us to another important theme and a recurring subject in U.S. intelligence, is that the idea that you never really leave the CIA once you are you retire or once you are discharged, whatever it is. Often these agents remain intimately involved, and Donovan was no exception. He would remain an integral part of the agency, and officially he returned to public life after the war, returning to his law practice. However, he remained present as an advisor to Allen Dulles during his tenure as director of the CIA, and was present for many.
Yeah, there's some people definitely leave the CIA and who are not with the CIA anymore. Larry Johnson, who we watched yesterday, is one of those guys. But there are other people in the world that Ray McGovern is sort of ex-CIA, but he's not welcome to the Christmas party anymore, from what I can tell.
Landmark operations. Now, just to wrap up on Donovan here, he may have been fairly irrelevant to our larger history, but he was the anchor that brought together all the agents in the OSS. Many of these agents would form the original cadre of the CIA. Many of the CIA's
cadre, not cadre or sorry.
Most notable and criminal acts would take place while these original characters were in control. So we can really see Donovan as the godfather of modern American intelligence. Now, even if you haven't read any history about the CIA, it is likely that you've heard the name Allen Dulles. He is arguably one of, if not the most important person in modern American history. He gets talked about quite a bit, a lot of glowing sort of op-eds about Allen Dulles, which I think are pretty shameful, as probably one of the most reprehensible characters in American history, but still incredibly influential. In this next section, which will be probably the majority of this part, we will outline Allen Dulles' career at the OSS, how he became a spy, and how he will be a major fixture of the next episodes, how he's going to rise to become the first civilian director of the CIA, and how this man had such impact on American history. So that being said, I just want to leave one last note before we get into Allen Dulles. Most of this background information about Dulles is from a really great book by David Talbot called The Devil's Chessboard.
Yeah, Devil's Chessboard's a pretty good book. I have it on Audible. Another great book is Legacy of Ashes. That's one I recommend. Usually my primary go-to. There's also individual biographies. Ghost Wars is a great one about what happened in Afghanistan into the lead up of September 11th. Yeah, and there's also Dulles' own Craft of Intelligence, which gives you some insight into what's going on there and how he thought he was doing.
It's actually a book that I have quite fond memories of reading, because it actually got me back into reading after taking quite a large break. It is a great read. I highly recommend it if you're interested in any of the topics talked about here, because a lot of my information is sourced from there, and David Talbot is an incredible author and very readable. So highly recommend The Devil's Chessboard. Let's talk about Allen Dulles. So Allen Dulles...
also Wilderness of Mirrors is a great book. Kind of mirroring. It's about James Jesus Angleton and I can never remember the other guy's name, but these two agents that were a great influence during the thing. And I remember once telling Mark Rubert, say, when are you going to cover this guy? And he's like, that guy's nothing but a drunk. And then he finally covered him, and then he's like, oh, this guy was pretty cool. I'm like, yeah, he was.
Found himself at the upper echelons of the American elite class. His maternal grandfather, John W. Foster, was Secretary of State under President Benjamin Harrison, and his uncle by marriage was Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State. So these are some serious links to the American democracy, American government. And Dulles himself came from one of the preeminent East Coast families of lawyers and Wall Street men. He was born in Watertown, New York, and then he would go on to graduate from Princeton University, and he would get his law degree at George Washington University. Before the war, Dulles worked as a lawyer at the prestigious Wall Street law firm Sullivan and Cromwell, which his brother, John Foster Dulles, who would be the future Secretary of State under President Eisenhower, was a partner of. So it's important to note that there is a severe conflict of interest here between the Sullivan and Cromwell list of clients and Allen Dulles' duties as an OSS agent. Let me elaborate a bit. So Sullivan and Cromwell's clients included many Nazi-adjacent firms such as IG Farben, who manufactured the Zyklon B gas that was used in the Nazi gas chambers. This also included Krupp AG, which is a German arms manufacturer, and many other notorious firms. What we see here is a person that is stuck between two worlds, right? They are working for the OSS that gets its orders mostly directly from President Roosevelt, who's trying to defeat the Nazis, but they are also representing their clients, who are these firms that are either fully Nazi, such as IG Farben and Krupp AG, or affiliated with the Third Reich.
Yeah. Remember when we were watching the show on Wednesday, and Allen Dulles leveraged all these connections? Now we know where those connections were coming from. How could he have all these great connections in all these Nazi firms? Well, they were his client list.
So this had a serious impact on Dulles' decision-making and some of the operations that the OSS would go on. Dulles' resume does not end there. He was also elected as the president of the Council of Foreign Relations in 1927, which is an influential conservative organization made up of business elites, bankers, industrialists, high-ranking government officials, and former military men. According to the organization's mandate, quote, their mission is to use interventionism to make the world safe for democracy, which obviously is quite in line with Allen Dulles, who has access to the OSS, which is one of the largest operating agencies in the world that can make interventions happen. Dulles used the...
Well, yeah, we need to use the interventionism. The OSS is not very good at doing interventionism at this time. The CIA will master it, but the OSS, as we've seen in other stories, doesn't do that very well.
This platform on the Council of Foreign Relations to influence others towards his firebrand view of America's future. He would state at the 1946 council meeting, so right after the war, that the United States should not go too far in its efforts to cleanse Germany of its Nazi past, because, quote, most men of the caliber required to run the new Germany suffer a political taint, i.e., they were Nazis.
And the other video showed that they did a lot of work to try to get rid of the Nazi stain off of these people.
This further entrenched Dulles as a clear Nazi sympathizer, which he was throughout his entire career. We'll continue to show more examples. It continues to come up.
Yeah, he's a Nazi lover, but also someone who believes in is an early Christian Zionist. So it's kind of a weird combination there.
Before we move on to Allen Dulles' exploits during the Second World War with the OSS, let's discuss IG Farben, the German chemical conglomerate that was on the Sullivan and Cromwell customer list, a bit before we move on to other things. The relationship between the Dulleses and the German chemical company IG Farben further displays where the Dulleses' sympathies lie during the Second World War, which were likely with the Nazis. IG Farben represents...
Yes and no. Like, it seems to be a lot more complicated than that. So that's just like, as we saw with him trying to get the priorities of the elders of Zion removed and working with various Jewish groups. So, like I said, it's like it's more complicated than initially seems. That from this guy, who, as we've seen, he's getting most of his source work from a very excellent book that's good for source work, but it does have a bit of its bent there, where I'm getting from a lot of different sources.
Represented one of the pillars of the Reich's industrial base. It was formed as a conglomerate of several of the top German chemical and pharmaceutical companies in the 1920s. We're talking a massive firm. We're talking one of the biggest companies in Germany. This was essentially a monopoly that included all of the major chemical producers in Germany and was one of the largest companies in the Reich. So IG Farben supplied many of the essential supplies, such as synthetic fuel, which IG Farben had the patent for at the time. And during the rise of Nazism in Germany, the Reich supplied price guarantees and purchased a 5% equity stake in IG Farben to help fund the increase in capacity of synthetic fuel production. So we're talking literal state control of this company. We are talking about a direct link to the Nazi party in IG Farben. And who is their legal representation? It's the Dulles brothers. So with that being said, IG Farben would produce a massive share of the fuel that would run the Nazi war machine. Because remember, the Nazis didn't have access to huge natural oil supplies. So they relied heavily on this synthetic fuel that was produced by Farben. IG Farben is not the only sinister.
Yeah, I looked into synthetic fuel production, and it seems that we dismantled it after the war because it was not as efficient as naturally creating oil. But I've always been a little suspicious about that. Why couldn't we replicate that in this day and age? It involves a lot of coal, so that is a problem. But like, you would think more people would want to make synthetic fuel in various places in good coal country. So that's always been more like, why did we suppress or fail to continue with this particular piece of technology?
Company that the Dulles brothers were working with at Sullivan and Cromwell, but it represents the cornerstone of the Dulles' complicity in Nazi terror. It is important to note that the intelligence agents casted from the Wall Street circles never stopped serving their former clients. This is an important note to make because it's almost like a revolving door. It's often this metaphor is used that, somebody from the private sector will come into the intelligence agencies or into the Pentagon, and they will still have their former clients' best interests in mind. It's just natural. I mean, a lot of these people continue to be shareholders. They continue to have deep, intimate relationships with the people on those boards. So it would make sense that they would continue to have sympathies for those former clients. And of course, the Dulles brothers knew that the war was going to end eventually, especially Allen, and that he might have to go back and work for Sullivan and Cromwell. So of course, he wants to continue to see the success of that firm, which means continuing to serve IG Farben and serve the Nazi Reich. So with that being said, the revolving door was in place here with Allen Dulles. He continued to serve his clients and, as we will see, defied the orders of the President of the United States and the State Department at every turn when it came to working with Nazis. So I guess I want to share one more anecdote about this, just to sort of really hammer home this Nazi connection, because I think it's quite important to understanding really how, cynical, calculating, and inhumane these people were. So both Allen Dulles, the OSS agent, and John Foster Dulles, the Sullivan and Cromwell law partner, actually had personal ties with the Nazis. Allen Dulles met with Hitler in 1933 while on a diplomatic mission with the State Department. So Dulles, was writing letters back, correspondences back to his State Department colleagues, and he displayed curiosity and interest in the rising fascist party.
A lot of people did. That's something that we kind of conveniently forget, that everyone saw the Nazis as a great way to stop the spread of communism. And Germany went from being one of the poorest countries in Europe into literally almost conquering all of it in 7 years. So we have to think there was a lot of sympathy for them. But the problem was Hitler just kept breaking every deal he ever made. So eventually people got tired of it.
Saw potential business deals with Nazi Germany and was particularly enamored by the Nazi propagandist Joseph Goebbels, who led the cruel anti-Semitic media empire in the Reich. Despite all his horrible features, Allen Dulles remarked that he admired Goebbels' quote, frankness and sincerity.
Met in 1933. This is shortly after they'd come to power. They haven't done all the bad stuff yet. Right? We got to take it into consideration at the time. And don't look at me as being Nazi sympathetic. I'm not. I'm Polish. I do not like Nazis. But I just feel we, as historians, we have to look at things in the context of the time the decision is made. So in 1933, everything's looking good and up, and then they start to go down the Nazi path and start actually delivering on some of their evil things. What they would say in 1939 may not necessarily have been the same thing they were thinking in 33. That's like a lot of people are enamored with Mussolini as well, right up until he gets into the Pact of Iron.
Lovely to hear. John Foster Dulles, the elder brother, he arguably admired Nazis openly, and he was even more of a Nazi sympathizer than his brother. He insisted that all correspondences from Sullivan and Cromwell to their German clients were signed off as Hail Hitler, and until his death in the mid-60s, John Foster Dulles publicly displayed his admiration of Nazism. So really, it runs deeper than just wanting to, serve their clients. The Dulles brothers saw some serious potential in Nazi Germany, not only from a business sense, but also from a geopolitical sense. So it's important to note this because it will keep coming up, especially with the CIA's continued support of fascist governments around the world. And I guess that leads us into another key tenet of the U.S. intelligence network and of U.S. intelligence history, is that these people are rabid anti-communist. This was ingrained in the institution at its most fundamental level, as most of its key members were members of the American ruling elite, who benefited from the capitalist world order. The Dulleses certainly fit into this anti-communist mold. Broadly speaking, American anti-communists viewed the Nazi regime in Germany as a useful fixture in Europe due to their violent anti-communist stance. They were seen as a bulwark against the Soviet Union. The Nazis believed...
Friend of the show, David S. there, he has some crazy stuff to say about this stuff, where he believes Britain was setting up the Nazis to be for the attack on Russia, and it was only because of FDR's pressure that the British and French ended up caving.
In private property, this aligned with the Dulleses, and even had a policy of reprivatizing businesses, wherein they restored seized property to former owners, especially the seized property of Jewish people. Anti-communist elites, such as the leaders of the OSS, viewed the Nazis as workable allies against communism in Europe. Therefore, the OSS and the subsequent CIA would often ally, arm, and fund fascists to fight the Soviet Union and other socialist states. This phenomena gave rise to multiple alliances forged between the OSS and high-ranking Nazi officials, but also led to what we can call stay-behind organizations. So essentially, underground organizations of former Nazis or I guess Nazi sympathizers that are armed and funded by these institutions to remain in Europe to keep it away from the communists. So we'll get into that a bit later. With all that being said, I think it's fairly clear that the OSS was largely ineffectual at infiltrating and sabotaging the Nazi regime during the war.
Yeah, that's much more of a British thing. Or the Soviets. Well, the Soviets didn't really do a lot of infiltrating in. They infiltrated France, and then the Nazis overrun France, and then they have all these agents there running around via the Red Orchestra. Yeah, there's definitely... Mostly what the OSS is doing is they do have the Jedburghs in France, coordinating with the resistance, and they have some operations in Southeast Asia, because that's where they were allowed to operate.
And imparting any useful information regarding enemy troop movements or enemy activity at all. I mean, this could have been chalked up to incompetence. I mean, Wild Bill was seen as largely incompetent, but I see it more as a lack of effort due to a lot of the high-ranking OSS agents having clear Nazi sympathies. What is clear, though, is that the OSS's main successes, if you want to call them that, these were by no means successes, if you're an anti-fascist, came near the end of the war and usually involved collaborating with Nazi elements. By outlining OSS activities during the end of the Second World War, we will see the laying of the groundwork for the future CIA operations throughout Europe, and their activities that are aimed at circumventing European democracy to ensure that communists or even left-leaning governments will never be elected in Western Europe. So, in the next part, we will be covering Operation Sunset, which is Alan Dulles' harebrained scheme to broker a separate.
Oh, yes, that'll be a fun time. There's a great Soviet movie about that. How a high-ranking agent basically stops Alan Dulles from doing this. Apparently, when it was being shown on TV in the Soviet Union, no crime went down to zero because everybody wanted to watch the show. Okay, yeah, so that was kind of my take on that. Close you down. So we've been talking about 40 minutes here. So like I said, I'm going to be doing more of these reactions to historian stuff and talking about it. But like I said, he's primarily running off of one source, and we'll try to be more larger sources of information here. I might put together a listing of books that I can recommend for people to learn more about this kind of stuff. Maybe we'll do like a top 10 of like spy books or something like that, or for World War II or whatever. Anyways, I've been talking about 40 minutes now. It's coming up to 5 o'clock. So if you like this, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. And if you want to know more about what's going on in the world, be sure to stop by and watch these shows. Okay. Bye-bye.